Chapter 11 of The Influence of Sea Power upon History, 1660 to 1783, by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, Maritime War in Europe, 1779 to 1782. The last chapter closed with the opinions of Washington, expressed in many ways and at many times, as to the effect of sea power upon the struggle for American independence. If space allowed, these opinions could be amply strengthened by similar statements of Sir Henry Clinton, the English commander-in-chief. In Europe, the results turned yet more entirely upon the same factor. There the allies had three several objectives, at each of which England stood strictly upon the defensive. The first of these was England herself, involving, as a preliminary to an invasion, the destruction of the Channel fleet, a project which, if seriously entertained, can scarcely be said to have been seriously attempted. The second was the reduction of Gibraltar, the third the capture of Minorca. The last alone met with success. Thrice was England threatened by a largely superior fleet; thrice the threat fell harmless. Thrice was Gibraltar reduced to straits; thrice was it relieved by the address and fortune of English seamen, despite overpowering odds. After Keppel's action off Ushant, no general encounter took place between fleets in European seas during the year 1778 and the first half of 1779. Meantime, Spain was drawing toward a rupture with England and an active alliance with France. War was declared by her on the 16th of June, 1779, but as early as April 12 a treaty between the two Bourbon kingdoms, involving active war upon England, had been signed. By its terms, the invasion of Great Britain or Ireland was to be undertaken, every effort made to recover for Spain Minorca, Pensacola, and Mobile, and the two courts bound themselves to grant neither peace, nor truce, nor suspension of hostilities until Gibraltar should be restored. The declaration of war was withheld until ready to strike, but the English government doubtless should have been upon its guard in the strained relations of the two countries, and prepared to prevent a junction of the two fleets. As it was, no efficient blockade of Brest was established, and 28 French sail of the line went out unopposed, June 3, 1779, under D'Orvilliers, Keppel's opponent of the year before. The fleet steered for the coasts of Spain, where it was to find the Spanish ships, but it was not till the 22nd of July that the full contingent joined. 7 precious summer weeks thus slipped by unimproved, but that was not all the loss. The French had been provisioned for only 13 weeks, and this truly great armada of 66 ships of the line and 14 frigates had not more than 40 working days before it. Sickness, moreover, ravaged the fleet; and although it was fortunate enough to enter the Channel while the English were at sea, the latter, numbering little more than half their enemies, succeeded in passing within them. The flabbiness of coalitions increased the weakness due to inefficient preparation. A great and not unnatural panic on the English Channel coast, and the capture of one ship of the line, were the sole results of a cruise extending for the French over 15 weeks. The disappointment due to bad preparation, mainly on the part of Spain, though the French ministry utterly failed to meet the pressing wants of its fleet, fell of course upon the innocent Admiral d'Orvilliers. That brave and accomplished but unfortunate officer, whose only son, a lieutenant, had died of the pestilence which scourged the allies, could not support the odium. Being of a deeply religious character, the refuge which Villeneuve, after Trafalgar, found in suicide was denied him, but he threw up his command and retired into a religious house. The scanty maritime interest of the year 1780 in Europe centres round Cadiz and Gibraltar. This fortress was invested by Spain immediately upon the outbreak of war, and while successfully resisting direct attack, the supply of provisions and ammunition was a matter of serious concern to England, and involved both difficulty and danger. For this purpose Rodney sailed on the 29th of December, 1779, having under his command 20 ships of the line, with a large convoy and reinforcements for Gibraltar and Minorca, as well as the West India trade. The latter parted company on the 7th of January under the care of 4 frigates, and the following morning the fleet fell in with and captured a Spanish squadron of 7 ships of war and 16 supply ships. 12 of the latter, being laden with provisions, were carried on to Gibraltar. A week later, at 1 P.M. of the 16th, a Spanish fleet of 11 sail of the line was seen in the southeast. They held their ground, supposing the approaching vessels to be only supply ships for Gibraltar, without a strong force of men of war, an unfortunate error from which they did not awake until too late to escape, owing to the yet more unfortunate oversight of having no lookout frigates thrown out. When the Spanish admiral, Don Juan de Langara, recognized his mistake, he attempted to escape, but the English ships were copper-bottomed, and Rodney, making the signal for a general chase, overtook the enemy, cut in between him and his port, regardless of a blowy night, lee shore, and dangerous shoals, and succeeded in capturing the commander-in-chief with 6 ships of the line. A 7th was blown up. The weather continuing very tempestuous, one of the prizes was wrecked and one forced into Cadiz. Several of the English ships were also in great danger, but happily escaped, and within a few days the entire force entered Gibraltar Bay. The convoy for Minorca was at once dispatched, and immediately after the return of the ships of war guarding it, on the 13th of February, Rodney sailed for the West Indies with 4 ships of the line, sending the rest of his force, with the prizes, to England under Admiral Digby. The state of politics and parties in England at this time was such that, combined with the unavoidable inferiority of the Channel fleet, it was difficult to find an admiral willing to accept the chief command. An admirable officer, Barrington, the captor of Sta. Lucia, refused the first place, though willing to serve as second, even to a junior. The allied fleet, to the number of 36 sail of the line, assembled at Cadiz. Their cruises, however, were confined to the Portuguese coast, and their only service, a most important one, was the capture of an entire convoy, largely laden with military stores, for the East and West Indies. The entrance of 60 English prizes, with nearly 3,000 prisoners, into Cadiz was a source of great rejoicing to Spain. On the 24th of October, De Guichen, returning from his contest with Rodney, came into the same port with his West Indian squadron of 19 ships of the line; but the immense armament thus assembled did nothing. The French ships returned to Brest in January, 1781. While thus unproductive of military results in Europe, the war in 1780 gave rise to an event which cannot wholly be passed over by any history of sea power. This was the armed neutrality, at the head of which stood Russia, joined by Sweden and Denmark. The claim of England to seize enemies' goods in neutral ships bore hard upon neutral powers, and especially upon those of the Baltic and upon Holland, into whose hands and those of the Austrian Netherlands the war had thrown much of the European carrying trade; while the products of the Baltic, naval stores and grain, were those which England was particularly interested in forbidding to her enemies. The declarations finally put forth by Russia and signed by Sweden and Denmark were four in number: 1. That neutral vessels had a right not only to sail to unblockaded ports, but also from port to port of a belligerent nation; in other words, to maintain the coasting trade of a belligerent. 2. That property belonging to the subjects of a power at war should be safe on board neutral vessels. This was the principle involved in the now familiar maxim, "Free ships make free goods." 3. That no articles are contraband except arms, equipments, and munitions of war. This ruled out naval stores and provisions, unless belonging to the government of a belligerent. 4. That blockades, to be binding, must have an adequate naval force stationed in close proximity to the blockaded port. The contracting parties being neutral in the present war, but binding themselves to support these principles by a combined armed fleet of a fixed minimum number, the agreement received the name of the armed neutrality. The discussion of the propriety of the various declarations belongs to international law; but it is evident that no great maritime state, situated as England then was, would submit to the first and third as a matter of right. Policy only could induce her to do so. Without meeting the declarations by a direct contradiction, the ministry and the king determined to disregard them; a course which was sustained in principle even by prominent members of the bitter opposition of that day. The undecided attitude of the United Provinces, divided as in the days of Louis XIV. Between the partisans of England and France, despite a century of alliance with the former, drew the especial attention of Great Britain. They had been asked to join the armed neutrality; they hesitated, but the majority of the provinces favored it. A British officer had already gone so far as to fire upon a Dutch man of war which had resisted the search of merchant ships under its convoy, an act which, whether right or wrong, tended to incense the Dutch generally against England. It was determined by the latter that if the United Provinces acceded to the coalition of neutrals, war should be declared. On the 16th of December, 1780, the English ministry was informed that the States General had resolved to sign the declarations of the armed neutrality without delay. Orders were at once sent out to Rodney to seize the Dutch West India and South American possessions; similar orders to the East Indies, and the ambassador at the Hague was recalled. England declared war 4 days later. The principal effect, therefore, of the armed neutrality upon the war was to add the colonies and commerce of Holland to the prey of English cruisers. The additional enemy was of small account to Great Britain, whose geographical position effectually blocked the junction of the Dutch fleet with those of her other enemies. The possessions of Holland fell everywhere, except when saved by the French, while a bloody but wholly uninstructive battle between English and Dutch squadrons in the North Sea in August, 1781, was the only feat of arms illustrative of the old Dutch courage and obstinacy. The year 1781, decisive of the question of the independence of the United States, was marked in the European seas by imposing movements of great fleets, followed by puny results. At the end of March, De Grasse sailed from Brest with 26 ships of the line. On the 29th he detached 5 under Suffren to the East Indies, and himself continued on to meet success at Yorktown and disaster in the West Indies. On the 23rd of June, De Guichen sailed from Brest with 18 ships of the line for Cadiz, where he joined 30 Spanish ships. This immense armament sailed on the 22nd of July for the Mediterranean, landed 14,000 troops at Minorca, and then moved upon the English Channel. The English had this year first to provide against the danger to Gibraltar. That beset fortress had had no supplies since Rodney's visit in January of the year before, and was now in sore want, the provisions being scanty and bad, the biscuits weevily, and the meat tainted. Amid the horrors and uproar of one of the longest and most exciting sieges of history, the sufferings of the combatants were intensified by the presence of many peaceful inhabitants, including the wives and families of soldiers as well as of officers. A great fleet of 28 ships of the line sailed from Portsmouth on the 13th of March, convoying 300 merchant ships for the East and West Indies, besides 97 transports and supply ships for the Rock. A delay on the Irish coast prevented its falling in with De Grasse, who had sailed 9 days after it. Arriving off Cape St. Vincent, it met no enemy, and looking into Cadiz saw the great Spanish fleet at anchor. The latter made no move, and the English admiral, Derby, threw his supplies into Gibraltar on the 12th of April, undisturbed. At the same time he, like De Grasse, detached to the East Indies a small squadron, which was destined before long to fall in with Suffren. The inaction of the Spanish fleet, considering the eagerness of its government about Gibraltar and its equal if not superior numbers, shows scanty reliance of the Spanish admiral upon himself or his command. Derby, having relieved Gibraltar and Minorca, returned to the Channel in May. Upon the approach of the combined fleet of nearly 50 sail in August following, Derby fell back upon Tor Bay, and there anchored his fleet, numbering 30 ships. De Guichen, who held chief command, and whose caution when engaged with Rodney has been before remarked, was in favor of fighting, but the almost unanimous opposition of the Spaniards, backed by some of his own officers, overruled him in a council of war, and again the great Bourbon coalition fell back, foiled by their own discord and the unity of their enemy. Gibraltar relieved, England untouched, were the result of these gigantic gatherings. They can scarcely be called efforts. A mortifying disaster closed the year for the allies. De Guichen sailed from Brest with 17 sail, protecting a large convoy of merchantmen and ships with military supplies. The fleet was pursued by 12 English ships under Admiral Kempenfeldt, an officer whose high professional abilities have not earned the immortality with which poetry has graced his tragical death. Falling in with the French 150 miles west of Ushant, he cut off a part of the convoy, despite his inferior numbers. A few days later a tempest dispersed the French fleet. Only 2 ships of the line and 5 merchantmen out of 150 reached the West Indies. The year 1782 opened with the loss to the English of Port Mahon, which surrendered on the 5th of February after a siege of 6 months, a surrender induced by the ravages of scurvy, consequent upon the lack of vegetables, and confinement in the foul air of bomb-proofs and casemates under the heavy fire of an enemy. On the last night of the defence, the call for necessary guards was 415, while only 660 men were fit for duty, thus leaving no reliefs. The allied fleets assembled this year in Cadiz to the number of 40 ships of the line. It was expected that this force would be increased by Dutch ships, but a squadron under Lord Howe drove the latter back to their ports. It does not certainly appear that any active enterprise was intended against the English coast, but the allies cruised off the mouth of the Channel and in the Bay of Biscay during the summer months. Their presence ensured the safe arrival and departure of the homeward and outward bound merchantmen, and likewise threatened English commerce; notwithstanding which, Howe, with 22 ships, not only kept the sea and avoided an engagement, but also succeeded in bringing the Jamaica fleet safe into port. The injury to trade and to military transportation by sea may be said to have been about equal on either side, and the credit for successful use of sea power for these most important ends must therefore be given to the weaker party. Having carried out their orders for the summer cruise, the combined fleets returned to Cadiz. On the 10th of September they sailed thence for Algeciras, on the opposite side of the bay from Gibraltar, to support a grand combined attack by land and sea, which, it was hoped, would reduce to submission the key to the Mediterranean. With the ships already there, the total rose to nearly 50 ships of the line. The details of the mighty onslaught scarcely belong to our subject, yet cannot be wholly passed by without at least such mention as may recognize and draw attention to their interest. The 3 years' siege, which was now drawing to its end, had been productive of many brilliant feats of arms, as well as of less striking but more trying proofs of steadfast endurance on the part of the garrison. How long the latter might have held out cannot be said, seeing the success with which the English sea power defied the efforts of the allies to cut off the communications of the fortress; but it was seemingly certain that the place must be subdued by main force, or not at all, while the growing exhaustion of the belligerents foretold the near end of the war. Accordingly, Spain multiplied her efforts of preparation and military ingenuity, while the report of them, and of the approaching decisive contest, drew to the scene volunteers and men of eminence from other countries of Europe. 2 French Bourbon princes added, by their coming, to the theatrical interest with which the approaching drama was invested. The presence of royalty was needed adequately to grace the sublime catastrophe, for the sanguine confidence of the besiegers had determined a satisfactory dénouement with all the security of a playwright. Besides the works on the isthmus, which joins the rock to the mainland, where 300 pieces of artillery were now mounted, the chief reliance of the assailants was upon 10 floating batteries, elaborately contrived to be shot and fire proof, and carrying 154 heavy guns. These were to anchor in a close north and south line along the west face of the works, at about 900 yards distance. They were to be supported by 40 gunboats and as many bomb vessels, besides the efforts of the ships of the line to cover the attack and distract the garrison. 12,000 French troops were brought to reinforce the Spaniards in the grand assault, which was to be made when the bombardment had sufficiently injured and demoralized the defenders. At this time the latter numbered 7,000, their land opponents 33,000 men. The final act was opened by the English. At 7 o'clock on the morning of September 8, 1782, the commanding general, Elliot, began a severe and most injurious fire upon the works on the isthmus. Having effected his purpose, he stopped. But the enemy took up the glove the next morning, and for 4 days successively poured in a fire from the isthmus alone of 6,500 cannon balls and 1,100 bombs every 24 hours. So approached the great closing scene of September 13. At 7 A.M. of that day the 10 battering ships unmoored from the head of the bay and stood down to their station. Between 9 and 10 they anchored, and the general fire at once began. The besieged replied with equal fury. The battering ships seem in the main, and for some hours, to have justified the hopes formed of them. Cold shot glanced or failed to get through their sides, while the self-acting apparatus for extinguishing fires balked the hot shot. About 2 o'clock, however, smoke was seen to issue from the ship of the commander in chief, and though controlled for some time, the fire continued to gain. The same misfortune befell others. By evening the fire of the besieged gained a marked superiority, and by 1 o'clock in the morning the greater part of the battering ships were in flames. Their distress was increased by the action of the naval officer commanding the English gunboats, who now took post upon the flank of the line and raked it effectually, a service which the Spanish gunboats should have prevented. In the end 9 of the 10 blew up at their anchors, with a loss estimated at 1,500 men, 400 being saved from the midst of the fire by the English seamen. The 10th ship was boarded and burned by the English boats. The hopes of the assailants perished with the failure of the battering ships. There remained only the hope of starving out the garrison. To this end the allied fleets now gave themselves. It was known that Lord Howe was on his way out with a great fleet, numbering 34 ships of the line, besides supply vessels. On the 10th of October a violent westerly gale injured the combined ships, driving one ashore under the batteries of Gibraltar, where she was surrendered. The next day Howe's force came in sight, and the transports had a fine chance to make the anchorage, which through carelessness was missed by all but 4. The rest, with the men of war, drove eastward into the Mediterranean. The allies followed on the 13th, but though thus placed between the port and the relieving force, and not encumbered like the latter with supply ships, they yet contrived to let the transports, with scarcely an exception, slip in and anchor safely. Not only provisions and ammunition, but also bodies of troops carried by the ships of war, were landed without molestation. On the 19th the English fleet repassed the straits with an easterly wind, having within a week's time fulfilled its mission, and made Gibraltar safe for another year. The allied fleet followed, and on the 20th an action took place at long range, the allies to windward, but not pressing their attack close. The number of ships engaged in this magnificent spectacle, the closing scene of the great drama in Europe, the afterpiece to the successful defence of Gibraltar, was 83 of the line, 49 allies and 34 English. Of the former, 33 only got into action; but as the duller sailors would have come up to a general engagement, Lord Howe was probably right in declining, so far as in him lay, a trial which the allies did not too eagerly court. Such were the results of this great contest in the European seas, marked on the part of the allies by efforts gigantic in size, but loose jointed and flabby in execution; by England, so heavily overmatched in mere numbers, were shown firmness of purpose, high courage, and seamanship. But it can scarcely be said that the military conceptions of her councils, or the cabinet management of her sea forces, were worthy of the skill and devotion of her seamen. The odds against her were not so great, not nearly so great as the formidable lists of guns and ships seemed to show. And while allowance must justly be made for early hesitations, the passing years of indecision and inefficiency on the part of the allies should have betrayed to her their weakness. The reluctance of the French to risk their ships, so plainly shown by D'Estaing, De Grasse, and De Guichen, the sluggishness and inefficiency of the Spaniards, should have encouraged England to pursue her old policy, to strike at the organized forces of the enemy afloat. As a matter of fact, and probably from the necessities of the case, the opening of every campaign found the enemy separated, the Spaniards in Cadiz, the French in Brest. To blockade the latter in full force before they could get out, England should have strained every effort. Thus she would have stopped at its head the main stream of the allied strength, and by knowing exactly where this great body was, would have removed that uncertainty as to its action which fettered her own movements as soon as it had gained the freedom of the open sea. Before Brest she was interposed between the allies. By her lookouts she would have known the approach of the Spaniards long before the French could know it. She would have kept in her hands the power of bringing against each, singly, ships more numerous and individually more effective. A wind that was fair to bring on the Spaniards would have locked their allies in the port. The most glaring instances of failure on the part of England to do this were when De Grasse was permitted to get out unopposed in March, 1781, for an English fleet of superior force had sailed from Portsmouth 9 days before him, but was delayed by the Admiralty on the Irish coast; and again at the end of that year, when Kempelfelt was sent to intercept De Guichen with an inferior force, while ships enough to change the odds were kept at home. Several of the ships which were to accompany Rodney to the West Indies were ready when Kempenfeldt sailed, yet they were not associated with an enterprise so nearly affecting the objects of Rodney's campaign. The two forces united would have made an end of De Guichen's 17 ships and his invaluable convoy. Gibraltar was indeed a heavy weight upon the English operations, but the national instinct which clung to it was correct. The fault of the English policy was in attempting to hold so many other points of land, while neglecting, by rapidity of concentration, to fall upon any of the detachments of the allied fleets. The key of the situation was upon the ocean. A great victory there would have solved all the other points in dispute. But it was not possible to win a great victory while trying to maintain a show of force everywhere. North America was a yet heavier clog, and there undoubtedly the feeling of the nation was mistaken. Pride, not wisdom, maintained that struggle. Whatever the sympathies of individuals and classes in the allied nations, by their governments, American rebellion was valued only as a weakening of England's arm. The operations there depended, as has been shown, upon the control of the sea, and to maintain that large detachments of English ships were absorbed from the contest with France and Spain. Could a successful war have made America again what it once was, a warmly attached dependency of Great Britain, a firm base for her sea power, it would have been worth much greater sacrifices. But that had become impossible. But although she had lost, by her own mistakes, the affection of the colonists, which would have supported and secured her hold upon their ports and sea coast, there nevertheless remained to the mother country in Halifax, Bermuda, and the West Indies enough strong military stations, inferior as naval bases only to those strong ports which are surrounded by a friendly country, great in its resources and population. The abandonment of the contest in North America would have strengthened England very much more than the allies. As it was, her large naval detachments there were always liable to be overpowered by a sudden move of the enemy from the sea, as happened in 1778 and 1781. To the abandonment of America as hopelessly lost, because no military subjection could have brought back the old loyalty, should have been added the giving up for the time all military occupancy, which fettered concentration while not adding to military strength. Most of the Antilles fell under this head, and the ultimate possession of them would depend upon the naval campaign. Garrisons could have been spared for Barbadoes and Sta. Lucia, for Gibraltar, and perhaps for Mahan, that could have effectually maintained them until the empire of the seas was decided; and to them could have been added one or two vital positions in America, like New York and Charleston, to be held only till guarantees were given for such treatment of the loyalists among the inhabitants as good faith required England to exact. Having thus stripped herself of every weight, rapid concentration with offensive purpose should have followed. 60 ships of the line on the coast of Europe, half before Cadiz and half before Brest, with a reserve at home to replace injured ships, would not have exhausted by a great deal the roll of the English navy; and that such fleets would not have had to fight may not only be said by us, who have the whole history before us, but might have been inferred by those who had watched the tactics of D'Estaing and de Guichen, and later on of De Grasse; or had even so much dispersal been thought unadvisable, 40 ships before Brest would have left the sea open to the Spanish fleet to try conclusions with the rest of the English navy when the question of controlling Gibraltar, Mahan, came up for decision. Knowing what we do of the efficiency of the two services, there can be little question of the result; and Gibraltar, instead of a weight, would, as often before and since those days, have been an element of strength to Great Britain. The conclusion continually recurs. Whatever may be the determining factors in strifes between neighboring continental states, when a question arises of control over distant regions, politically weak, whether they be crumbling empires, anarchical republics, colonies, isolated military posts, or islands below a certain size, it must ultimately be decided by naval power, by the organized military force afloat, which represents the communications that form so prominent a feature in all strategy. The magnificent defence of Gibraltar hinged upon this. Upon this depended the military results of the war in America; upon this the final fate of the West India Islands; upon this certainly the possession of India. Upon this will depend the control of the Central American Isthmus, if that question take a military coloring; and though modified by the continental position and surroundings of Turkey, the same sea power must be a weighty factor in shaping the outcome of the Eastern question in Europe. If this be true, military wisdom and economy, both of time and money, dictate bringing matters to an issue as soon as possible upon the broad sea, with the certainty that the power which achieves military preponderance there will win in the end. In the War of the American Revolution, the numerical preponderance was very great against England; the actual odds were less, though still against her. Military considerations would have ordered the abandonment of the colonies; but if the national pride could not stoop to this, the right course was to blockade the hostile arsenals. If not strong enough to be in superior force before both, that of the more powerful nation should have been closed. Here was the first fault of the English admiralty. The statement of the First Lord, as to the available force at the outbreak of the war was not borne out by facts. The first fleet under Keppel barely equaled the French, and at the same time Howe's force in America was inferior to the fleet under D'Estaing. In 1779 and 1781, on the contrary, the English fleet was superior to that of the French alone, yet the allies joined unopposed, while in the latter year De Grasse got away to the West Indies and Suffren to the east. In Kempenfeldt's affair with De Guichen, the admiralty knew that the French convoy was of the utmost importance to the campaign in the West Indies, yet they sent out their admiral with only 12 ships; while at that time, besides the reinforcement destined for the West Indies, a number of others were stationed in the Downs for what Fox justly called the paltry purpose of distressing the Dutch trade. The various charges made by Fox in the speech quoted from, and which, as regarded the Franco-Spanish War, were founded mainly on the expediency of attacking the allies before they got away into the ocean wilderness, were supported by the high professional opinion of Lord Howe, who of the Kempenfeldt affair said: "Not only the fate of the West India Islands, but perhaps the whole future fortune of the war, might have been decided almost without a risk in the Bay of Biscay." Not without a risk, but with strong probabilities of success, the whole fortune of the war should at the first have been staked on a concentration of the English fleet before Brest and Cadiz. No relief for Gibraltar would have been more efficacious, no diversion surer for the West India Islands, and the Americans would have appealed in vain for the help, scantily given as it was, of the French fleet; for the great results that flowed from the coming of De Grasse must not obscure the fact that he came on the 31st of August, and announced from the beginning that he must be in the West Indies again by the middle of October. Only a providential combination of circumstances prevented a repetition to Washington in 1781 of the painful disappointments by D'Estaing and De Guichen in 1778 and 1780. Chapter 11.